Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast with Mike and Mike. Sales is a thinking process. This podcast will help you learn about what works in sales, how to hone your skills, and increase your success. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and I am here with Mike Simmons. We have no Mike Connor today. What do you think about that, Mike Simmons? That doesn't happen very often.
It does not happen very often, and Connor's in a very good place right now. The surf is probably pretty good.
Well, you can never go wrong there. Well, we're going to sneak in a listener question when Mike Connor is not here. And this question comes from Jared in Florida, speaking of surf. And Jared said, in our organization, there is a lot of talk about KPIs. How do we know we're measuring the right thing? Mike, before you get going on that, I always like to, just in case, most people in sales know KPIs, but there may be some people that don't. What are KPIs?
Key performance indicator is what the acronym stands for, at least from my perspective. Somebody may be able to correct me if I'm wrong on that, but that's what I've got in my mind. Okay,
so in organizations, they talk about key performance indicators. That's what you're measured on. But Jared said, how do we know we're measuring the right thing?
Jared, that is an awesome question. And depending on the level of effort that the organization went through when they created those KPIs, you may not be measuring the right thing. So like most instances, you've got a design component where you design and determine what your KPIs are going to be. You implement those KPIs, you begin to measure those KPIs, and you should have a feedback loop process where you evaluate whether or not the KPIs you're measuring should change over time. And that's a bit high level, but I'll kind of bring a specific example. We work with startups, as most of you know, early stage companies. One of the KPIs that they like to measure or use as a way to measure their success is revenue that's generated. Many times organizations that fall into this area are pre-revenue. Sometimes they're generating revenue, but they're not generating revenue at the scale that they expect to generate revenue. And sometimes there's a significant amount of time between each of those deals that they bring into their organization. So if you're using revenue as your primary KPI, you may not be measuring something that you can impact directly in the short term. And I'll give you an example. Let's say that we're working on a SaaS-based product, a software as a service product, subscription-based, where the expectation is that individuals will use this product on an ongoing basis. This could be something like Slack. It could be something like some of the other products that we've discussed on previous podcasts. But if I've got this product, one of the things I want to measure is, are people coming in the door? Do I have people who are actually coming in and using the product? If I'm getting people to the point where they're coming in the door, and that coming in the door means that maybe they're just hitting the website, then I go to that next level and I say, beyond those who are hitting the website, how many of them are actually registering? How many of them are subscribing to my service? Once I've established my subscribing to the service number, then I look at how many people are consuming content. How many are actually using this thing that I'm delivering? It's great that they use it once, but then the next question should be, do they use it multiple times? Do they come back? Am I creating a level of engagement? If I've got people who are coming to the door, I've got people who are registering, I've got people who are using content, and I've got people who are coming back, the next piece of information I'd want to measure in this kind of a scenario is how many people are sharing that with others? How many people are giving that thing, sharing that thing with others inside their network? And how is that driving adoption rates? So these are all very important metrics to determine the viability of a product that you have in the marketplace, but aren't necessarily revenue generating metrics. They might be tied to revenue depending on how you charge for that initial registration or if you've got some kind of a freemium model. But on the KPI side of things, in a scenario where I hear people focus primarily on revenue, usually what I ask them to do is take a couple of steps back and start talking about what kind of behavior do we expect to see that will someday lead to that revenue.
Now that you're not accountable to somebody above you, you're at the head of a startup now. So I'm
still accountable to my wife.
Okay. That is a fact. But when it comes to sales, I know you're accountable to bring home money to buy groceries. But at work, the job that you do every day, you can measure anything you want now. So what are you doing to measure your individual success?
That's an awesome question, Jody, and one to be expected. So we look at a couple of different things. We fall into the trap of revenue. Revenue is what is the lifeblood to the organizations we work with. So that's the ultimate measure of success. Are we delivering revenue into the organization? And depending on the client that we're working with, the type of revenue that we're delivering can be measured in different ways. There are some organizations we work with who are a bit more transactional, and there's an expectation on the amount of revenue that will come in time over time. In others, there's longer sales cycles. So measuring revenue doesn't really align, or is not a key piece. What we do though is we'll use tools like Salesforce or HubSpot. Slack, as an example, provides some metrics, and we'll look at some of those metrics to see what kind of engagement do we have across the team. When we're sending messages in Slack, are we seeing responses? Is the team engaged throughout the day? We've got some folks who work remotely. We've got some folks who work inside of an office. We will also measure, and I try to stay away from these, but we'll measure some of the other tasks, activities like number of emails that go out in a given day, or number of phone calls that are made in a given day, or number of tasks that are created in a given day. Some of those metrics don't tell the complete story, and they may end up driving behavior that you don't want. So this is an instance where I get into the discussion that we'll have with clients frequently. Be careful what you measure, because there may be some unintended consequences associated with driving that behavior. Now, as people who are out there working on different things, we find different ways to crack the code and different ways to game the system. There are ways to inflate in your CRM the number of activities that you have, and those activities don't necessarily always translate well to revenue. So rather than looking at it and saying that, and actually I would say that at Catalyst, first off, we do not have a set of KPIs that we use across the team that we manage the organization to. We're just not that far along in our journey. It hasn't made sense for us to do that. We get more information interacting with our team and getting the direct feedback from them on what's working in the marketplace, how things are working, because in many of the instances, many of the organizations we work with, we're still in that code cracking mode, which is how do we identify appropriate product market fit? How have we validated that product market fit? How have we validated who the right consumer is of this thing that we're delivering? Once we've cracked that code, how do we set things up for scale and make sure process is implemented properly? So, Jody, I don't know if I answered your question completely, but there are good things that you can do when it comes to measuring inside an organization, and there are some bad things that you can do when measuring inside an organization. So as a leadership team, you should always evaluate those measurements and make sure that they are impacting some component of the success of the business. If they don't align back to the business, you might be measuring the wrong stuff.
Well, you mentioned that what you measure can end up setting yourself or the organization up for bad behavior. And Dan Tyre from HubSpot, he said that it can be 1 year out from when you initiate a relationship before you get to even talking about a sale. In my personal experience, I found easily it's 9 months. When you start a conversation, easy. It can go 9 months before it gets somewhere. So how do you measure something so soft like that without setting yourself up for bad behavior?
Yeah, I think that you get back into traditional funnel activities. So you say, okay, top of funnel, I need to have these kind of activities that are going to lead to these kind of conversations that will lead to this type of a discussion that will lead to this type of a potential relationship, and just work your way down, and you start playing with the math there. But when you look at that, I think, and there's a couple of things I heard there. One of them is, hey, the things I'm doing today are about building my business in the future, not necessarily driving business tomorrow. And it becomes really difficult for founders to get that message through their heads. They're so focused on, how do I drive this thing now? I need the revenue now. I've got to keep the business moving along. And you can use things like KPIs to indicate and illustrate success in the organization outside of the revenue that is being generated. And I want to be careful about falling into that trap of generating traction versus revenue. And we've talked about that in historic podcasts. And I can hear Connor chirping in my ear about, oh, it sounds like you're talking about traction. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about are measurable things that say, yes, I am moving the ball forward. These incremental goals that I set for myself personally. And maybe that's a good transition here too, is talk about personal KPIs. You may have KPIs for an organization that are handed down to you and you can't influence them. You're not going to be able to change them. But what you can influence and what you can change are your own personal KPIs that you measure yourself against. And those KPIs might be, I'm going to conduct research on 10 new organizations this week, or 2 new organizations per day, or 1 organization in the morning and 1 organization in the afternoon each day of the week. And you can look back and you can measure your success against that objective. And if you meet your objective at the end of the week, you've done research on 10 more companies than you had the week before. So start looking at that as a way to kind of, if you need this kind of direction at an individual rep level, start thinking about the KPIs you'd measure for yourself if you were running your own business as its own franchise.
Well, I like what you've said there, because just like you, Mike, I have the entrepreneurial spirit, and there's a little rebelliousness when you're like that. And I know at some of my jobs where you would get KPIs and I'd always say, well, okay, those are all right, but that's not exactly what I want to do. And I would set up some of my own. But I think you have to be cautious with that. Can you give us some counsel on if you're going to set up your own independent? I think you want to make sure they still move you towards what your organization is measuring success by. Can you give us some insight into that?
Yeah, I think everything should align. And, many times when I talk with organizations, in the context of leadership and leading an organization, we talk about the CEO or the general manager or the head of an individual business unit staffing the spotlight. And they've got the spotlight pointed in a given direction. And that spotlight, the things that the business does should be covered within the spectrum of that spotlight. From within the spotlight, you've got the individual lines of business or individual teams or individual groups who operate as flashlights. Those flashlights should shine within the spectrum of the spotlight. Everybody should be moving in that same direction. And then you as an individual contributor should be the laser pointer inside your own business unit's flashlight, which is inside the spotlight of the organization. And you should all be working toward the same objective. So if you're designing your own personal KPIs based on an internal objective that you've decided that doesn't align with what the business is trying to do, you may want to check yourself, because you're probably going in the wrong direction. And I would take that back up to the top of the ladder too. If you're putting out an edict for KPIs and your spotlight is shining at 360 and then all of a sudden turns to 270, or you're headed straight north and you turn due west, and then you turn around and head and point due east, remember, it's going to take a little bit of time for the flashlights and the laser pointers to catch up with you.
Okay, my last question about KPIs and measuring success. Quite often they're handed down to us and we don't have control over them. So in this question, assume, Mike, that I am a great performing salesperson and I just don't have a bad attitude, and that's where it's coming from. So I'm a great salesperson. KPIs are handed down, and I just think, my gosh, they're measuring the wrong things. I don't agree with some of these. How do you handle that?
Well, you never fail alone is another comment we've made out here a couple of times. You, as a high-performing individual inside your organization, you've built up a high amount of credibility, and you should be able to go to your boss and have a pretty candid conversation. Now, that doesn't mean taking the same direct approach that I might take and lay it out and say, this is what I think we should be doing. You may want to flank them a bit and share how some of the things you've been measuring in your own territory have aligned with and help to predict success. But as a manager of an organization, if an employee or a member of the team came to me and said, hey, I've been looking at this and I think this is something we should look at. We should evaluate as a performance indicator that can help us predict higher levels of success. If they bring data, I'm all ears. Now, I tend to be a data person, so know who you're working with. If you're dealing with someone who is a bit more on the visionary, creative side, likes to have their own ideas, then I'd approach them with a number of questions and get them moving toward that direction. If they tend to be more toward the data side, I'd bring the data side.
Okay. So as we wrap up here, Mike, is there any last thoughts you want to put out there to Jared and people like him that have KPIs and measuring success on their mind?
We've hit on a number of things. There are a couple of really important concepts and ideas that Jared can put into action today and that anybody who's listening to this can put into action today. Begin with your end or desired state. Put yourself in the shoes of your customer. Put yourself in the shoes of the end user of that product. Put yourself in the shoes of the person that's all the way down at the end of the stream and work your way backward. If what I know is I need to have in a SaaS-based product, I need to have a high level of engaged users who come back and use the product on a frequent basis, and they help me bring new users into the product, then measure based on that. Measure, things like engagement, things like sharing, things like number of times that someone comes into the platform. Bringing it back to this onto the sales side, I would look at things and say, how many deals do I need to have out in my pipeline over a 12-month period in order to hit my number? If my number is $1.5 million number, and I feel pretty confident that I'm going to be able to close, that my average deal size is somewhere in the neighborhood of $500K, I know that I need to close 3 of those deals in order to hit my number for the year. So one of my KPIs that I would have for myself is I need 3 times whatever the number is to determine how many prospects I would be working with in order to get to 3 deals. So let's say I close 20% of the opportunities that I'm working on. I've got a 20% close rate. I would need to have 15 $500,000 deals out there in order to be comfortable that I would hit my $1.5 million number later this year. So you've got to do that personal math. So personal math, be detailed in the numbers, make sure it aligns with what you're looking to accomplish, and constantly evaluate whether or not those are the valid numbers you should be looking at. Take in new information and adapt.
Well, thank you, Mike. And if you have a question you would like Mike and Mike to answer on the Catalyst Sale podcast, send an email to hello@catalystsale.com. If you want to check out what we're up to at Catalyst Sale, visit catalystsale.com. Thank you, Mike, for a great episode, and thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale podcast.